Okay, you probably guessed that this presentation is going to be a massive critique of psychology, and to a certain extent you could be right. However, in all fairness to recent policy announcements, which will see more incentives opened up to Hollywood, and in recognition of the events of last week, which pretty much saw this floor empty on Wednesday when Hobbit fever entered the capital, I have decided, at the last minute, to give this presentation a subtitle. Why a subtitle? Well, to be honest, I'm not going to present to you 3 major research projects and the integration of the findings into one short presentation. This would eventuate in complete madness and boredom. If anything, I'll use this presentation to show how the activity of research is both motivated by our passions, angers and histories, as well as, when done properly, orchestrated in such a way that we can't help but be shaped by our research. I'm going to attempt to do this by taking you on a journey into the analysis of my now ancient PhD and its eventuation into digital storytelling. But we must, in order to get back from our journey again, start somewhere. My research did not start at the beginning of my academic career. It started in a small region which often falls off the radar of mainstream New Zealand, the West Coast. And that's the real West Coast, folks. Now this picture tells a lot. It's from the 1960s. The coast was in massive economic decline because its main industry, mining, was not creating or even sustaining enough employment for the menfolk. It was probably around this time that the coast discovered a new economy, the growing of a very particular variety of grass. I didn't grow up in the coast in the 1960s. I was a child of the 80s, another period of decline, and I remember growing up in a community in which addiction, crime and home bake of the white variety were very huge problems. These were not the worlds that I lived in, but they were the reality in my community, and I saw a lot of kids going into care. I also remember the newspaper talking about these issues and the investment into programs like COPS and into alcohol and drug counselling. I also remember the community grapevine, the real newspaper, talking about how the coast is ripped off by the government. Even today, I still see this happening in a green-conscious urban city where people are hungry for the latest technology and so critical of the miners whose income is dependent upon supplying the resources out of which these technologies are made. Later in my high school years, the formative researcher in me was formed even further on my first day. My social studies teacher asked students in our class to stand up and be counted if they lived in a state house, were known to the police or welfare, had a sole parent or lived in a country community. I stood up for 3 of these factors. My teacher then excused me and another 4 boys standing from attending his class. As far as he was concerned, we weren't going to succeed, so why waste his time on us? The resistor in me fought back. I attended all his classes for 3 years and never achieved any higher than a C+, but I attended. Later my resistance involved taking on the education system by choosing teacher education. I did think social work, but my learning of the 1980s firmly ingrained in me that problems in society are more than just problems of the family or individual. But I never entered into the classroom once I'd learned that schools reproduce inequalities. But that's another presentation in itself. I chose to dwell further into my past, and I chose to try to make a difference for the young people I worked with. So I decided to continue through to a PhD. By this stage, my education training meant that I had a basic understanding of human development, psychology, sociology, and political science. It meant that I was exposed and influenced by thinkers like Michael Apple. The ways in which adolescents are treated in their teenage years creates tensions that last forever. Class, race, gender identities are formed in interaction with institutions. If the definitions of youth that we build into our policies and programs in schools and elsewhere are as much a part of the problem as they are part of a supposed solution, then we risk creating identities that will come back to haunt us for generations to come. So from this I embarked into a PhD. This was very quickly followed by a smaller project funded by the Families Commission. Recently, I've been privileged to work with young people on another research project taken to the UN about the rights of young people in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, out of all the words in this slide, you would have seen a word that for some sends shivers down your spine: post-structural. It's a threatening word for even those who are aware of its meaning. Why? Because when you understand the word, all of a sudden you realise that you have to conquer a whole lot more words and meanings. Post-structural philosophy and methodologies have had a huge impact on the development of myself as a researcher. So I will endeavour to give some meaning to this word and to this obstacle. Post-structural theories and methodologies are concerned with language and the impact of language on both the speaker and the person or object of reference. In short, post-structural researchers like myself strongly believe that language and knowledge are connected to practices of power and resistance. Just listen to these two sentences and ask yourself, where is the power in each sentence? Hannah's mum took Hannah to work today. Hannah's mum took Hannah to work today. Hannah went to work with mum today. Hannah went to work with mum today. Post-structural research looks at the play of language to find stories of power, inequality and resistance. It is a powerful method, and in my own research I've endeavoured to take it out of academia and fuse it with other community development practices in youth work to find a space for possible transformation and empowerment. So my PhD research and Families Commission research focused on the representation of young offenders and the families of young offenders. Within both these projects, there was clearly a pattern emerging. It was becoming quite clear that often the stereotypes or common sense stories we have about young people have at some point been influenced by expert academic theories, even if these influences were hundreds of years in the making. It also became very clear to me that this alignment had very real effects both for the young people being represented and for the readers of this knowledge. For example, our media representations of child abuse, to take another subject, tend to focus on Māori and Pacific families. If you were to ask a West Coaster how many Pākehā families severely mistreated or even killed their child in the last year, the answer would be close to zero. As far as coasters are concerned, child abuse is very much a brown problem. This is far from the reality, but unfortunately it is the focus of the media, and it is a reflection of the truths that have come through major research studies over the past 20 years. To take this theory a step further, power is not knowledge, but intellectual knowledge brings with it a lot of power. We use research to inform our policy and our practice. We know that today wouldn't be happening without our desire as a society, and more probably an economy, to be able to turn knowledge through research into sellable capital. However, the reason why this is so is because at a common sense level, society accepts the truths of academic research, particularly research with a quantitative and very Western edge, as facts. When we accept this research and the values it is based on as truth, we allow that knowledge to dominate ourselves and the very meaning of our lives. Some would call this a process of hegemony, buying into one set of values but seeing them as truth for all. However, this doesn't always happen. Knowledge is not power, despite what the library signs tell us. There is no one type of knowledge, but knowledge is always connected to power, and wherever there is power, there is also resistance. I can accept the label of a West Coaster and be seen as a white bait loving, gumboot wearing and rain observing person, or I can resist it. So that is a very quick lesson into post-structuralism and its foundational place in my research. Let's see it in action. This quote comes from a newspaper in 2002. It all started on a May morning much like this. It was nearly 18 years ago in Invercargill, and a young couple were welcoming a second child into their crime-filled world. He was a baby boy. They called him Aaron. His father was a career criminal, Robert. His mother, a bubbly redhead who was developing a terminal illness which would kill her before this child's 15th birthday. Experts say The story which follows was virtually inevitable. At 6, a smiley boy who likes building play huts with his big brother is seen to live with his Uncle Eric. Uncle Eric is a car thief, just like Aaron's dad, so when the little nephew comes to say, Uncle Eric takes the opportunity to pass on a little McDonald know-how. At 7, Aaron picks up his first conviction. Over the next decade, he will clock up 64 convictions, ranging from driving offences to unlawfully taking cars to theft. He spends his childhood shuttled between houses. Aaron leaves school altogether after a couple of years split between high schools. He is 14 when his mother dies. He is 17 and in prison when his father dies in a truck crash. He smashes his cell and later attends a funeral. This is a pretty typical description of a young offender and their family. If I was to analyse this with a group of students or even a community group of leaders, I would expect to hear that it is media stereotyping. The media are just the first point of call in the blame game. But really, are they just making something up? Look at it really closely. Like my experience in high school, this picture of the young offender is built on turning risk factors into common sense knowledge. Young offenders are more likely to come from dysfunctional families with a history of crime. Persistent young offenders are probably going to be male. They are also more likely to be living in transient situations and to be disconnected from other social services such as school. We see the same story, the story of Aaron, in political policy. The sad thing is, what happens to girls? Well, they are either seen as really bad or mad, because offending is not a characteristic of young females. And yes, this description can be found in media, policy, and academic journal articles. So let's get to the source. This is from a major New Zealand study. Some of you may have recognised Caspi as one of the lead researchers in the Dunedin Health and Development study. Here we find connection to the media and government policy. We also see the author hinting that resilience may be connected to a young person's genes, not to the environment. Now, none of you would have seen this article in context, but it comes from a major medical journal. The focus of the article is on whether ethnicity is a risk factor. Caspi comes to the conclusion that yes, Māori have a gene that puts them at risk of both child abuse and crime. Now, this claim is highly controversial, but it flickers in and out of history. It covers the pictures of deviance in our papers. It is noted in government policy, but only Caspi labels it. Everyone else uses the phrase, ethnicity is not a risk factor. However, Māori are far more likely to be represented in crime statistics. So let's dig deep into the story. Where did it come from? Is it time to make this knowledge of psychology just a little bit more difficult, especially when it comes to youth? To do this, we need to look into Western history, because developmental psychology started as a Western knowledge. Believe it or not, adolescence and our understanding of youth is a very new knowledge. Before the Industrial Revolution, developmental stages tended to go from child to adult. The in-between moment of adolescence arose in a time of turmoil itself, the 1890s. During these years, Western economies, including New Zealand, suffered a major depression. Like today, young people found themselves unemployed, crime rates steadily rose, and statistics showed 10 to 18-year-old males to be a reason for the turmoil. Into history stepped G. Stanley Hall. He is known as the father of adolescence. His basic definition was that adolescence was a time of storm and stress which occurred between 10 and 24. Young men would be more likely to commit crimes during this time because they were learning to take risks in life and control their bodies. Young women were these deviant creatures who were learning to hide their periods, should be kept at home because allowing them to exercise any form of deviance would be problematic. Hall's theory was highly criticised at the time by fellow academics, but the public and government officials loved it. It gave reason for the statistics, and it placed the blame off society and the depression and firmly onto the shoulders of young people. It helped in the formation of youth work. His theory informed the Boy Scouts movement. His theory also helped inform the need to make school compulsory, and as history now shows us, it started a pattern. Every time young people are seen as a problem, changes are made to keep them in education. Hall's theory also influenced future developments in youth development. Piaget and Erikson are two examples, and it is here that there are real problems. Why? Because unlike the academics of Hall's time, no one asked on what he based his ideas. Hall's theory combined two streams of thought, evolutionary thinking and recapitulation theory. Most of us are familiar with evolutionary theory. Recapitulation theory was a theory of the ranking of the world's races or ethnicities. Recapitulation theory stressed that the development of civilizations was like a tree, where cultures developed out of savagery into a more civilized position. Cultures were thought as going through a turbulent adolescence as they slowly evolved into a civilized position. By combining recapitulation theory with evolutionary theory, people were able to argue that races which could not attain a civilized position would simply die off, survival of the fittest scenario. Hall took these theories and reapplied them to the development of an individual. Hall connected childhood at the base of the tree, the uncivilized, and adulthood to the top, the civilized. Now we might see this as an implausible connection, but Hall took a logical step. The ideas that circulated industrial societies at that time shared the same sort of reasoning. Using romanticised notions of childhood, industrial thinkers connected childhood to nature and playful development. Using recapitulation theory, colonial theorists described the in-between of uncivilized and civilized as a turbulent time of upheaval and change, as races left behind them their uncivilized ways and strived to become civilized. Hall transferred this turbulent time directly to adolescence. The in-between time of childhood and adolescence he called storm and stress. Although this might have seemed a logical and scientifically relevant step, particularly in 1905, Hall's theory was not without consequences that overflow to today. Lesko argues that Hall's theory had two implications. First, Hall's theory enabled adult society to group all young people as adolescents, different to adulthood, and in doing that, adult society was able to control young people. Hall did do this, without a doubt. He did argue that adolescents were different, and that adult society needed to control the passion of youth. Second, Lesko argues that Hall's theory trapped youth from minority cultures within the uncivilized or in-between position. To Lesko, recapitulation theory was, and still is, problematic, because minority cultures and races can never really reach the position of civilized. Some of them remain trapped in adulthood and never really leave it behind. Indeed, if we look at how youth crime is talked about in New Zealand, we can see this very same thing happening when authors describe the youth at risk, typically the Māori youth at risk, as never really reaching adolescence. Instead, these young people are trapped by and in the risk factors of their childhood. Now our theories of development are not informed by metaphoric trees. Now we have the bell-shaped curve of normal distribution. Theorists using the bell-shaped curve argue that the human population can be distributed across an even curve with a norm in the middle. We usually see the curve being used in intelligence research, but researchers also use the curve in many statistical analyses of pathology and abnormality. The weird thing is that in all these years of research, no one has been able to fully define normal. Our whole knowledge of human development and psychology is based on, as Nicholas Rose argues, a knowledge of the abnormal, not the normal. When authors and commentators apply these theories of normality and abnormality to young people, they tend to focus on the abnormal youth at risk and the risk factors which signify the difference of this youth compared to normal youth. The types of risk factors these authors draw upon relate to age, intelligence, psychological well-being, family composition, gender, ethnicity, and socio-economic status. In all this, there is a risk of double discrimination, where some young people are denied a position of deviance or whose deviance is seen as doubly problematic. We can see this with gender, as talked about before. If being female is not a risk factor to crime, your criminal behaviour is very, very bad and you're most probably very, very mad. All these risk factors inform an argument for early intervention, the control of youth for their own good. The result of this is control in the hands of the professional, and young people have very, very limited power or agency. So where my research turned was to focus on this point in the cycle, the point of power and resistance. I have to admit, with the risk of being fired before I even start, I did not go down the line of positive risk psychology, simply because I found that it was too much based on a definition of risk. For example, Kay McLaren's literature review, on which our strengths-based youth strategy is based, mentions risk more than 100 times and has less than 10 references to strengths or positive factors in development. So I knew needed to use new lenses. The two that I started with were sociology and critical pedagogy. Sociology enabled me to look at deviance as a form of resistance. My question would be, resistance to what? And my eyes would move to society and look at equalities and inequalities. I would also look for points of strain where a spoken reality is very much a myth for young people in that immediate moment. Realities like, if you work hard, then you'll succeed. Tell it to the hard-working miners of the coast, and they will quickly reply that the truth is controlled by the people who create jobs, not by how hard you work. These points of strain are called anomy, and the truth of hard work paying off is the hegemony that we buy into in our country, where so many children starve their way through the day. Critical pedagogy is a teaching technique based on the work of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian peasant who turned academic. It is basically about reading our world for the stories of power and inequality, and then rewriting our world. It is a form of literacy education, and it is a form of community transformation. It allows for resistance to be spoken about in a positive way, and at least a dialogue to start. Finally, and this is where I'm moving to in my research next, there is a need to acknowledge that the professional knowledges we work with are absent of all the answers. The split in the Reformation between theology and the real sciences has seen hollow answers to the deep question of purpose and meaning in life. The move where I'm going to in my research is not to break with psychology, but to explore the intersection between sociology, psychology and theology. It is perhaps here that critical pedagogy can bring about meaningful transformation to the lives of our young people and our community as a whole. I'd like to finish with a couple of videos, because most of all, resistance is not a language for me to speak for others, but for others to speak for themselves. These are two groups of youth from the digital storytelling research project I led in 2002. As you listen to them, listen for the story of resistance that they're giving. And in amongst the story, listen to what Freire says is our very essence of our being, that every person has hope. Listen for the story of hope that is embedded in the stories of resistance. Thank you.
I see a leader, an activist for Māori rights. His rights were abused. We are human, but they treat us like rats. We feel, see, hear racism around us. We have a right to express ourselves. We don't want war, we want to be heard. Let us be heard.
New Zealand gangs.
Gang pictures can intimidate people,
but they can also encourage people to join gangs.
Gang pictures are bad influences on people.
You have to follow what the gang says, or else you will get beaten up.
Be a leader for yourself.
Gang members bully girls into prostitution. They beat them up so they will prospect for them. Girls should not be involved in gang life.
Respect yourself.
When your family chooses to be in gangs, it ruins your future.
Always put your family first.
Static.